Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to our guests in Japan and the region. Good morning to those in Europe. As the ambassador of Switzerland to Japan, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event on transition finance, organized by the Embassies of Norway and Switzerland in partnership with the Japanese Business Federation, Keidanren. Why did we all come together to talk about transition finance? What is at stake? Imagine an overall loss in global economic value of 14% by 2050. According to the Climate Economics Index of reinsurance giant Swiss Re, this is what we must expect if we do not meet the 2050 net zero emissions targets. This frightening scenario would entail severe, incredibly painful consequences for our environment and for our people. In terms of GDP, the Japanese economy would stand to contract by 9.1% between now and 2050, the Norwegian economy by 11.3%, and the Swiss economy by 4.4%. Our three countries are determined not to let this happen. We are technologically advanced and open economies with a global presence. We want to rise to the challenge, and we have therefore committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2015. Our governments want to shape the effective framework conditions in order to enable all actors to play their role in achieving these transformational targets. In just a moment, we will hear more on the efforts of the Japanese government. Ultimately, our companies can and must be the main drivers of the transition. We therefore invited key business actors from our three countries to share their experiences and advice with us. How are companies responding and adapting to the transition? What challenges do they face, and what are their needs? We will hear from a panel of companies in some of the most affected sectors: energy, steel, and chemicals. Finance plays a critical role in enabling industries to embrace the transition. How can transition finance ensure that those companies which are willing to go carbon-free have the means to do so? We will hear more on this from a panel of financial institutions. Today, our aim is, as organizers, is to provide a platform to share perspectives so that we can learn more about transition finance here in Japan and beyond. We are therefore proud to welcome a diverse audience of decision makers and experts here in the room and online. We are joined by representatives of Japanese corporations and heavy industry trade associations, financial service providers and authorities such as the Financial Services Agency, as well as academia and media. Let us listen, let us discuss, let us learn, so that together we may avert the frightening scenario which I outlined at the beginning. A big thank you to the Norwegian Embassy and Keidanren for their partnership and efforts in bringing us together today. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Shinichi Kihara to the stage for his keynote speech. Mr. Kihara is the Deputy Director General for Technology and Environment at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Mr. Kihara, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Grüezi, and Gukvel. I'm Shinichi Kihara, Deputy Director General for Environmental Affairs in the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. His Excellency Ambassador Andreas Baum, Her Excellency Lina Aune, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude for this opportunity to participate in this very timely and important event today on transition finance. Japan, Norway, and Switzerland all inherit beautiful nature, and our people have harnessed it and enjoy living with it for a long time. The three countries have also sophisticated technologies and innovation, which has functioned as strong engines for our growth. And today, given the pressing need to address climate change and realize sustainable growth, I believe that Japan, Norway, and Switzerland are the perfect trio to jointly contribute to solving this global challenge. Today, I will focus on climate transition finance, the new but important concept, which allows different industries and parties to reach the common summit of carbon neutral 2050 through multiple paths, just as you see on this slide. This is the Swiss Alps or Japan Alps, and any path you will follow, depending on who you are, which industry you belong to. And there are some parties already driving the drone, but some people are still walking, sweating, walking to the summit. So with that, I would like to jump into my presentation. To realize our global carbon neutral goals, green initiatives such as introducing renewable energy is very important, and green finance, such as green bonds and loans, are expanding already. And also, promoting innovation is also indispensable to achieve the carbon neutral goal, and therefore innovation finance, such as government funding, becomes driving force. However, we are missing an important category in reaching carbon neutrality. There are hard-to-abate sectors which do not have operational zero-emission solution today, because innovative technology are not ready in a technological or economic sense, or also because the energy mix is based on geographical backgrounds. Companies in such sectors cannot immediately jump to a decarbonized society, and there has not yet been an effective financial tool to adequately support their pathways to reach carbon neutral goals. They face dilemma because they see divestment, even if they are committed to carbon neutral targets and strategy and have serious R&D or investment plans. The required amount of investment in this area is huge, and that's why transition finance plays a crucial role to bridge the gap. Therefore, we need to develop a business environment where all players have access to finance according to their transition pathways and their stages through green finance, innovation finance, and transition finance. So, Government of Japan promotes transition finance through three-step policy tools. Firstly, METI, together with the Financial Service Agency and Ministry of Environment, formulated the basic guidelines on climate transition finance in May last year. Secondly, from autumn last year, METI has published sector-specific roadmaps, one by one, to indicate technologies deemed as transitional. 7 hard-to-abate sectors are covered: iron, steel, chemicals, electricity, gas, oil, cement, and paper and pulp. Thirdly, starting from last summer, METI have selected model cases of transition finance and have subsidized their certain certification process. So far, we have selected 12 good cases, projects, amounting to $2.5 billion projected procurement. Compared to other finance tools, the uniqueness of transition finance is that a strategy to net zero is required. That is, the adequacy of the use of proceeds is not the only element of assessment. Requiring these two elements is quite demanding. So the step one, the basic guidelines on transition finance. The basic guideline describes 4 key elements to be assured in transition finance. Element 1, companies need to have a strategy to achieve the goal of Paris Agreement and appropriate governance to practice such strategy. Element 2, core business activities are environmentally material. Element 3, pathways and targets based on companies' own strategies should be science-based. And element 4, disclosure of their investment plan and reporting are crucial. The basic guidelines are consistent with the Climate Transition Finance Handbook published by ICMA, the ICMA. It is a group of international financial institutions and has published several sustainable finance guidelines, including green bond guidelines. They are widely used in the financial community. Some important points of the basic guidelines are the use of proceeds should be based on strategies. With regard to the third element, science-based strategies, internationally recognized scenarios such as IEA, as well as NDC of the government or government directions, such as Japan's sector roadmaps, can be referred. Also, external verification and assurance are recommended. Then step 2, summary of Japan's transition sector roadmap. The most important in the roadmap is credibility. We try to secure credibility in 3 aspects. That is, roadmap is comprehensive, ambitious, and feasible. First, the roadmap in 7 sectors covers approximately 70% of total CO2 emission in Japan. Secondly, the roadmap is ambitious, as all sectors aim to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And we have set up a task force formulating roadmap for climate transition finance, consisting of experts in technology and environment from academia, representatives from industry and finance. They discussed intensively to make sure each roadmap is consistent with internationally recognized scenarios, including the speed of the introduction of new technologies, such as hydrogen, and it is aligned with the goals of Paris Agreement, as well as net zero by 2050. And thirdly, the roadmap is feasible, as technologies in the roadmap will be implemented by the support of national policies, including Japan's NDC targeting 46% of greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. And also other fundamental national policies, such as the Green Growth Strategy and Strategic Energy Plan. Although various entities such as research institutions and NGOs have published their transition pathways, Japan's roadmap, supported by both high ambition and national policies, provides a feasible and credible emission pathway. The roadmap is intended for use for both companies and the financial sector. Companies who need finance are required to have a transition strategy of their own to achieve carbon neutrality based on science-based target and pathways. Therefore, companies can refer to our roadmap when they explain the adequacy of the new facility that they are going to invest in. At the same time, financial institutions can use the roadmap as reference to evaluate those companies, whether they meet the criteria to be deemed as transition activities. As for the content, the roadmap shows various technology options towards 2050, incorporating both existing technology and future available technologies, with the timing of their practical application. Also, estimated CO2 emission reduction associated with the introduction of technology are also shown. The roadmap is also a living document to be updated if necessary, in accordance with technological development, needs by financial sectors, and also geopolitical developments. Let's see examples of the roadmaps. This is a first example on the left is the roadmap for power sector. It shows step-by-step introduction of decarbonized power sources, such as renewables, hydrogen, thermal plant, nuclear, and CCUS. As hydrogen firing and CCUS are currently in developing stage, the roadmap shows their installation starting in 2030s. Separately, we categorize transition power, such as co-firing of fuel ammonia or co-firing of hydrogen and biomass with existing coal or gas thermal plants. These technologies exist already today. Ammonia and hydrogen co-firing are currently under demonstration, but will be introduced in the late 2020s. On the right is the roadmap for iron and steel. The difficulty of this sector is having no viable zero-carbon technology as of today. As you can see, in this decade, best available technology we can implement are energy-saving measures and increase of efficiency. After 2030, we project a gradually increased access to innovative technologies shown in colored arrows, such as hydrogen-based steelmaking or blast furnace, and hydrogen-based direct reduction technologies. Therefore, we assume the CO2 reduction pathway is gentle in the 2020s and 30s, but steep in the 2040s. To summarize generally, in the 2020s and 2030s, innovative technologies may not be viable in some sectors, but energy saving and energy efficiency measures can be utilized to maximum extent in such cases. In the 2040s, R&D efforts today will materialize and drastically accelerate reductions. This incorporation of future technologies and their investment is a notable difference from the concept of EU taxonomy. We also note that the slope of the reduction pathway for power, steel, and other industries are different, and all sectors are heavily influenced by the reduction of CO2 emission in the power sector. Next is the step 3, the model project. Let me see. Yes, the first one on the left is JFE Holding. This is a major Japanese iron and steel company. You have a panelist later, Mr. Tezuka. They plan to issue transition bonds of maximum 40 billion yen in June this year. And this is the first case in iron and steel sector worldwide. With regard to their transition plan and targets, JFE committed to achieve net zero by 2050 and reduction of CO2 emission by 30% in 2030. They plan to invest in innovative steelmaking process, energy saving, manufacturing of eco-friendly products such as electromagnetic steel sheets for EVs, and renewable energy systems. It means that JFE carries out energy savings by using best current available technologies, contribute to other sectors' reduction of CO2 emission with their products, and prepare themselves to switch to carbon neutral operations enabled by drastic innovation technology in coming future. Another case is shipping on the right. NYK Line is a major international shipping operator. NYK issued 20 billion yen bond in July last year. This was the first case in the international shipping industry. NYK committed to a reduction of GHG emission by 30% in 2030 and net zero by 2050. Their pathway is certified by science-based targets, and they will invest mainly in LNG-fueled ship in the short term. At the same time, they emphasize switching to zero-emission ships through R&D on ammonia and also hydrogen-fueled ships. Lastly, Japan's effort on transition finance is not closed inside Japan. We support wider spread of the concept in emerging countries, especially in Asian region, where energy demand is expected to grow along with economic growth. In this context, METI has hosted Asia Green Growth Partnership Ministerial Meeting, or AGGPM, inviting 20 or so ministers from Asian region. As part of Japan's comprehensive support package called Asia Energy Transition Initiative, AETI, we supported the launch of Asia Transition Finance Study Group led by over 40 private financial institutions and others in September last year. The ATF study group aims to provide practical guidelines for transition finance and list of support required from governments and other stakeholders. the study group released an interim summary just before, in April this year, and final recommendation is expected in September this year. Through these initiatives, we will support Asian countries to make steady progress towards realistic transition while maintaining a balance between economic development and people's life. So, climate change and sustainability is a difficult challenge for human beings, and it is essential to bring together the wisdom of the world to discover solutions and to open up new future. As countries which all have sophisticated and innovative industry sectors, there's large potential for Japan, Switzerland, and Norway to collaborate on accelerating transition finance. We expect private sectors from all countries participating in today's event to find joint opportunities and play an active role in this process. Government of Japan is committed to provide support to strengthen our partnership and contribute to secure and sustainable future of Japan, Norway, Switzerland, and the world. Thank you very much. Dankeschön and Tusen tak.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful event. We've heard already some very interesting points, and I'm sure we're going to be picking up on those in the panel discussions as we get going. So, I'm Tova Kinooka, Director and Co-founder of Japan-based Sustainability Consultancy Global Perspectives, and I have the great honor of moderating these two panels here today. So thank you very much to the Norwegian Embassy, the Swiss Embassy, and Keidanren for the invitation. The first, the transition, as we've heard just now from Kihara-san, to sustainable business models, processes, and technologies is both complex and extremely costly. The massive scale and the pace of change required is such that no one company or industry can do this alone. We're going to need a lot of collaboration. Our first panel is looking at transition finance from the recipient's perspective. And we're going to look at what specific challenges organizations are facing in the transition to a low-carbon economy and how they are tackling those challenges. So with me today, here on stage, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Tezuka Hiroyuki, Climate Change Fellow at JFE Steel Corporation, who we've just heard a little bit about, so welcome. Online, we also have Ms. Catherine Peachy, Vice President and Head of Structured Finance at Equinor, and Mr. Chris Argent, Head of Business Sustainability for the Asia-Pacific region at Syngenta. So 3 very different organizations represented, and welcome to you all. Is everyone okay sound-wise? Can we hear us all clearly? Yep, wonderful, that's great. So I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists to give us a very brief introduction, both to yourself and to your organization. And I'd like to start with Tezuka-san.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And my name is Hiro Tezuka. I'm with JFE Steel Corporation, which Mr. Kihara already mentioned. So here has already touched upon the key points which I prepared for this speech. But let me share the case of the hard-to-abate industry. The biggest challenge for us is that we don't have the carbon-neutral steel processing technologies yet. But the JFE Steel has committed to invest 340 billion yen by 2030 to achieve our midterm carbon reduction target. And just recently, we have announced to issue 300 million yen transition bond, which Kihara-san already touched upon. But the steelmaking process historically used carbon as a reducing agent to make steel out of iron ore. That was the case in the past thousands of years. So the replacing carbon to the hydrogen or other the new innovative technology is a very big challenge of human being. So we do need to develop completely new process with the innovative approaches. But it will take many years to develop such innovative technologies and take decades to replace existing capital assets by newly developed process. That's the reason why the transition, the roadmap takes longer time, decades, in the case of steel. But during the whole transition process, we need to reduce emission from current steelmaking process as well, because the demand is there. The steel is a necessary basic material for the society to make the sustainable and the resilient the society while adapting to climate change. So also the transition to net zero society, the demand for high performance steel such as high strength steel to support the mega the size windmills and high efficiency electric steel for EVs will increase. So the demand will increase. So we do need to expand our own supply capacity as well. So we need sufficient and sustainable transition finance to invest all those innovative process improvement, and providing necessary high performance materials. So in addition to the R&D process. So the hard to abate industries tend to be seen as brown in the current trend of ESG finance, but those are the sectors which really, in fact, require massive transition financing. Sharing this necessity, METI of Japan has developed, as Mr. Kihara mentioned, the basic guidelines for climate transition finance in May 2021, and the technology roadmap for transition finance in iron and steel case in October 2021. So JFE has been awarded, as Mr. Kihara mentioned, as a model case for such transition finance with our own roadmap. Actually, our own roadmap on the left side, which is just met with the METI's roadmap on the right side. So that's a kind of a convincing story for the financial market. So we expect to issue our first transition bond coming June. And I hope that we can get enough sufficient the first financing from the market to start our very long journey toward carbon neutral process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tezuka-san. So as we can hear, this is not an easy transition to make, and we'll be digging into the details of that as we move forward. First, I would like to go to the online panelists and ask Catherine Peachy, please, to introduce yourself and your organization.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me today. So as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm Catherine Peachy. I'm the head of structured finance for Equinor. And for those of you that don't know Equinor, we're an international energy company headquartered in Norway. We're engaged in exploration, development, and production of oil and gas, as well as the development and operation of wind and solar power and low carbon solutions. Oil and gas obviously is a challenging area of decarbonisation, but we have huge ambitions. We have ambitions to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 50% group-wide by 2030, and to reach net zero carbon intensity in scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions by 2050. And to deliver on that, we're working in 3 main areas. So we're looking at how to optimize our oil and gas portfolio, which is the core of our business, towards more carbon efficient production, through abatement, through electrification, and through consolidation of our portfolio. One example of that, for example, is our Hywind Tampen project, which is an 88 megawatt floating offshore wind power project, which will provide electricity to our Sonora and Gullfaks offshore field developments in Norway. We're also doing a lot in renewables. So we're market leader in offshore wind. We've been operating offshore wind for a number of years now in the UK and in Germany, and we're expanding into many other markets, including the US and beyond in Europe, as well as looking at opportunities in Asia, including places like South Korea. And we're targeting 12 to 16 gigawatts of installed renewables capacity by 2030, which is a very large amount. And we're also looking at new opportunities in what we call low carbon solutions. So that's carbon capture and storage, as well as hydrogen production and generation. We are an industry shaper in the UK, where we have a large cluster of projects at an advanced stage of development, and we're hopeful of taking those forward with government support later this year. And we've also developed the Northern Lights project in Norway, which is now 30% complete and has EU funding. And we have an aim to have 15 to 30 million tonnes per annum of CO2 storage and transport capacity by 2035. So to achieve that, more than 50% of our gross capex is going towards renewables and low carbon solutions by 2030, which is a very large amount of what we're doing. But even though we have plans to allocate huge amounts of capex towards that, given the ambitions that we have, we are going to need financing to enable all of those ambitions. So we see it as a huge part of the energy transition going forward, and looking forward to talking a bit more about that today.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. And last but not at all least, Mr. Chris Argent from Syngenta, if we could hear from you, please.
Thank you, Tove. Honoured to be participating in today's important discussion. I'm Chris Argent, Head of Business Sustainability at Syngenta Asia Pacific. Syngenta is a global agri-tech company that provides products and services to farmers, primarily in seeds and crop protection products. And the role of agriculture in global emissions is very clear. I'm going to share my screen to a slide to guide my opening remarks. So bear with me 1 second. Let's put that on full screen. Can we see that? Okay. So the connection between agriculture and climate is clear. 18% of global emissions come from agriculture currently. It's the #2 sector in terms of contribution to global emissions. But the good news is that there's an enormous opportunity to make a significant reduction in the emissions from agriculture in a way that can meaningfully support the global need to achieve a 1.5 degree warming target. And clearly this has to start with an organisation's own emissions. At Syngenta, we have set targets to reduce our emissions by 2030 with a focus on carbon intensity, water intensity, and waste intensity. And there are a range of performance levers that we are using to drive this: waste minimisation, treatment optimisation, supply chain design, logistics optimisation, the carbon intensity of our energy supply, as well as energy efficiency programs. And progress is positive, but needs to remain a fundamental focus of our determination to contribute to net zero targets. But beyond our own operations, there is a huge focus at Syngenta that through the products and services that we offer, that we accelerate innovation to mitigate climate change on farm and the contribution of on-farm practices to agricultural emissions. And innovation is key to this, with the areas of resource efficiency and climate smart farming being priorities for Syngenta. Encouraging crop rotation, for example, helps return nutrients to the soil. It interrupts pest and disease cycles, improves soil health, soil health and increases biodiversity on farm. Encouraging more farmers to adopt cover crop practices keeps the soil in place, bolsters soil health, and reduces pollution. They're also an important part of a soil carbon sequestration strategy. So it increases soil carbon levels over time, and encouraging that practice could be hugely impactful. Other agronomical practices like minimum tillage. Tillage loosens the soil, exposing that soil to soil organic matter to the air earlier. Oxidization happens earlier, with a consequent release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So minimum tillage reduces the impact of that, leaves crop residues to protect the soil, and decreases the use of fossil fuels in field preparation. So elevating our responsibility as a company to look at the end-to-end agricultural practices is a critical piece of this, helping farmers to manage better their input use, such as fertilizers. It's got to be the right amount of fertilizer at the right time in the context of their geography and their crop. Encouraging on-farm practices that reduce inputs overall and provide better environmental outcomes, such as soil health management, as I mentioned before. And through the focus that we have at Syngenta on research and development and continuous improvement, developing better crop varieties that are more resilient, more stress resistant, this all contributes to the improving the uptake of on-farm practices that are climate smart. But fundamental to this is we need to do it in a way that increases yields for farmers, that increases profitability for farmers, that addresses real day-to-day pain points for farmers. We need to grow more food with less, that's clear. And farmers who play such a critical role in food security, they need to see that the benefits of climate smart farming are tangible and meaningful on a day-to-day basis. The last point I'd like to make, and it's wonderful that it's been a theme already in people's contributions, is the importance of partnerships. This is a complex issue. Nobody can solve this on their own. And so working with partners throughout the value chain, as well as with NGOs, academics, government agencies, we can find localized farmer-centric solutions that drive this positive change. There's just a couple of examples on the slide here. One in Japan, Riso Care. It's a solution being used in Japan at the moment for direct rice sowing in paddy fields, and just that change in the process reduces emissions from rice production. In the Philippines, we've just started a pilot project to improve soil health in the Corn Valley. This will improve yields, it'll improve profitability for farmers, and it helps to reclaim degraded land. Reverte in Brazil, looking outside Asia Pacific, is a truly ambitious but wonderful project that aims to restore more than 1 million hectares of degraded pasture land. And in the process, food production increases, contributing to greater food security. So none of these projects would be possible without vision, innovation, and partnership. And it's in this spirit that this discussion today is so important. How can we combine our collective knowledge, our experience, to really contribute to accelerating progress in this area? So I look forward to learning from my fellow panelists and from the overall discussion. So thank you, Tova.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Oh, and I'm hearing an echo there. There we go. So I think each of the panelists has outlined very clearly for us some of the challenges facing their specific industries. And as we've heard both from Kihara-san at the beginning and from the panelists, these are very, very different depending on the industry. But partnership is a word that's come up again and again, innovation as well. I'd like to pick up on perhaps the role of regulators in transition finance. So Tezuka-san, I'll come to you first for this one. What is the role of regulators in transition finance? And what I mean by that is, what is the role you as JFE Steel would like them to play? How far should regulators go?
Thank you. Thank you for that very important question. And as I mentioned during my speech, our process is very difficult to proceed. And there is no guaranteed single silver bullet point kind of the innovation. And there is no guarantee that each innovative process is going to be succeed in the coming decades. So the government need to take care of, need to be the kind of the moderator to picture out the whole process. We also depend on the some other players' progress. In the case of a hydrogen steel making process, we do need huge hydrogen supply infrastructure, which is supported by also the government. So the timing and the schedule must be well coordinated, even before even if we succeed in the developing hydrogen steel making process. If there is no hydrogen supply in the capacity exists, the technology cannot be deployed. So the coordination among sectors to best perform all the opportunities is the very important part of the government, to be the kind of the coordinator of the whole very complex process.
Right, yes, thank you very much. It is, as you say, a very complex process, and all of these moving parts are very much interconnected, right? What happens in one space doesn't happen independently and needs to be part of a bigger picture. So I'd like to come to Catherine with the same question. For the energy industry, particularly, this is a difficult challenge, right? Where should regulation come in? How far should it go? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the key for regulators is consistency and transparency. They need to be transparent about how they're going to support these sectors and how they're going to maintain that support over a period of time. If we think about what we've seen in some other parts of the world, the regulators have had a very important role in supporting some of these new technologies and enabling financing to be raised against them. And then if we look at specifically the transition finance side of things, I think that consistency of measurement, that consistency of how we see transition financing and what is transition financing and what's approved needs to be very clear from the regulators in terms of how we take the industry forward.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you for those comments. And on that point, you mentioned transparency and also, measurement. What is being measured? How is that being reported? Chris, I'd like to come to you and ask, with this increasing pressure on companies to set targets, to track emissions, to reduce emissions, are the current systems measuring the right things? And if not, what could be improved?
Yeah, thanks, Tove. Look, I think it's absolutely critical that the focus should be on Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions as we currently are, and that organisations are focusing on reducing their own footprint. That needs to be fundamental, and I think the process that we have in place is very much focused on that. I think the points Catherine made about transparency and consistency are absolutely critical as well to support the credibility of that. And ensuring that it is standardized and measuring the right thing. And as that develops, I think, over time, perhaps that could be expanded. How can we account for the overall emissions reductions achievements of the products and services of a company's operations? What it makes, what it sells. Does that have a role in looking at the totality of a complex problem? I mean, there are market-driven and reputational incentives for companies to already do that, but that's just the facet of a free market, in my opinion. There are value-driven incentives for companies to do that, but not every company is driven by values. So if there was in the system a systemic incentive to account for the emission reduction impact of the products and services of a company and their operations. I wonder whether that would really be a way to accelerate the outcomes. And that's what we need to be focused on here is the outcomes. And so the system, considering looking at that, a way to do that in a way that is consistent, transparent, standardized, I think could really unlock huge acceleration in this area.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. Overall impact is very different to just looking at the immediate impact. So thank you for raising that point, Chris. I'm very conscious of the time. It's racing away from us very quickly. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists for some final comments here. So starting off with Tezuka-san, you're working obviously in JFE Steel, but you're also chair of the working group on the Keidanren's global environmental strategy. You've worked globally as well with many different organizations. What are your thoughts on aligning globally on standards when it comes to transition finance? What would you like to see happening?
Thank you very much for that question. And actually, we do need to have the global standard on calculation or the of evaluating the progress. And we support the ISO or the standardization process for each industry sectors to develop the very objective calculation methodologies for the sectors. Also, the promoting such kind of calculation methodologies to the country. Developed countries are okay anyway, but in the developing countries, particularly in Asian region, we started promoting sharing our experience for the reporting CO2 emission numbers or intensity numbers, annual reporting system, which Japan has been doing in the past decades, so that they can do the similar kind of the assessment approach. And actually, I happen to be the chairing the India-Japan Iron Steel, the cooperative bilateral cooperation committee, the sharing our approach to that the kind of reporting system with the Indian steel industry, which is developing and quite growing quite fast. So in that sense, we can contribute not only in Japan but also in the global base the transition process of the industry sectors.
Thank you. So sharing best practices across companies, but also across industries, across territories, different markets, really key to
sector-based approach is probably very important.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Catherine, coming to you, what would you like to see happening here moving forward, particularly for the energy industry?
I think the key thing is that there's a very clear pathway for the big players within the energy industry to decarbonize. Equinor has set out very clear plans, realistic plans, we think, and we see that our shareholders appreciate that. And I think that's something that's needed across our industry from all the big players. To really decarbonize and think about some of the new technologies that may be needed to do that. We're going to need support from regulators, from governments to do that. And it's clear that we're going to need a lot of financing as well. So I think it's really about working together in partnership with our peers, with our partners, and also with governments and financiers to really strengthen the industry and develop in the way that we need to.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And finally, Chris, over to you.
I'd like to pick up on something that Tezuka-san said. I think, the complexity and diversity of Asia, if we look at that, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this stuff. I know that's kind of a theme that's come through as well, but particularly from an agricultural perspective, agriculture is inherently local. It's dependent on climate conditions, technology, development, all those sorts of issues that are, as I said, inherently local. Ultimately. So I think focusing, as I mentioned before, on outcomes, what is it we are trying to achieve, rather than trying to import or enforce a process. And that requires, again, partnerships, local knowledge, and respecting and understanding the differences between different geographical areas and crops, and the technology available to farmers. And so from a smallholder farmer perspective, critically important that access to markets improves. Technology helps to do that. Access to technology is critical. And of course, access to finance. But access to finance, although that's important, is not as meaningful as access to markets. If you've got the finance, that's great, but you need to be able to sell what you're growing at higher value. And that requires a focus on localization and process and partnerships.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I think that ties back very nicely to Kihara-san's image that he showed at the beginning of there being many routes to the top. It's like you say, not one size fits all. So thank you very much to all of the panelists here for the first panel, for your time. We're a little bit over. Sorry about that. It's gone very quickly. Thank you all for your contributions, and we'll look forward to picking up on those as we move into the second part of today. Thank you very much. All right, so welcome to the second half of our event today. 30 minutes goes very, very quickly, it seems, but we're moving on now to having heard about the challenges of different organizations and industries from the first panel. We're now going to look at the other side of the equation, the financing of this transition. So on this second panel, we have here today on the stage with me Mr. Takegahara Keisuke, Executive Fellow, Research Institute of Capital Formation at the Development Bank of Japan. Welcome, Takegahara-san. Online, we have Mr. Judson Berkey, Managing Director, Group Head of Engagement and Regulatory Strategy, and Chief of the Sustainability Office for UBS. A very busy man, by the sounds of it. Welcome. And Mrs. Karine Smith-Ihenaho, I hope I've said that correctly, Chief Governance and Compliance Officer for Norge Bank Investment Management. So welcome to our three panelists today, and thank you for taking the time to join us. So as with the first panel, I would like to start by asking each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their organization. I'd like to follow the order on my program, so come to Mr. Judson Berkey for the first introduction, please. So if we could come to you, Judson.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tove, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers from Japan, Norway, and Switzerland for bringing together this unique event. I think it's a great opportunity to share learnings across countries, across sectors, across companies, so very much value this chance to be here. As mentioned, I work in the Chief Sustainability Office of UBS. I also have an industry role with the Institute for International Finance, where I'm the industry chair of their Sustainable Finance Working Group. UBS is a globally systemically important financial institution. We have roughly 4 trillion of assets under management that we manage on behalf of our clients in one form or another. We're also a large bank, particularly in our home market, Switzerland. And we were one of the original founding members of the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative, as well as the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and also the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And earlier this year, released our own pathways and plans for our net zero commitments for 2050 for both our on-balance sheet financing, where we've mapped out pathways for 4 sectors, fossil fuels, power generation, and commercial and residential real estate, as well as our asset management portfolios and our institutional business, where we've committed to 235 billion of net zero aligned assets under management in our asset management business by 2030. But obviously we can't do that alone. I think that's already been a great theme of the interventions so far today. Clearly we have a high interconnectivity and dependence on our clients, our either investee companies or our lending counterparties, either individuals and or companies. So clearly part of it is about working with. Partnerships is one of our key corporate identifiers. We speak of people, planet, and partnerships when it comes to sustainability topics. And so part of what we try and do is really engage with either investee companies or engage with our lending counterparties and really help them understand the trends that at work, the transitions they need to make, and ultimately their success becomes our success. So clearly we want to work through a transition pathway with them. And I think that idea of transition being a journey has also been, I think, well noted today and something that's key to us. So one of the key things that we engaged in early on was a cross-industry collaboration called Climate Action 100. We're really in the asset management business. A number of asset managers have come together to really engage with companies on a very proactive basis to talk to them about their corporate strategies, their transition paths. We found that very, very successful for us, for our clients. We recently did an evaluation of that collaboration at the end of last year. We looked at a number of the companies that we were involved in, sort of tried to rank them into different buckets, whether we thought we had made excellent progress or they had made excellent progress, some good progress, some progress. And about 60% of the companies we looked at, we would put into the excellent or good bucket. But certainly there were some companies that hadn't made as much progress as we would have hoped. And we went through an evaluation process around that and ultimately did decide to disengage from a few companies. But that's the exception. It's not the rule that we would like. And so it really is about working together to achieve the understanding of the pathways. And that's where I would really congratulate Japan for the work it's done. I think that's a great example to give to other countries, other markets, about how to work together, the government, the industry, the finance sector, to map out pathways, understand the financing needs along those pathways, and really to facilitate those collaborative conversations, government, real economy, finance sector, about how to really flow the finance to support the transition. So I think there's a great example there for others to learn from. Certainly something I hope to take back to Switzerland, also potentially bring into some of the international discussions, and certainly very much value the work that Japan has done in combination with Switzerland in groups like the International Platform for Sustainable Finance and in the G20 as well. So Tove, let me stop there and pass to the others, but happy to answer some of your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Judson. And I would like to hand over now to Takehara-san.
Thank you, Tove-san, for a kind introduction. Let me explain in Japanese. Sorry.
I'm from the Development Bank of Japan. The Japanese government owns 100%. So we look at both the financial and economic benefit, try to make sure both can be achieved. And DBJ considers that transition as an important theme. As Kihara-san mentioned earlier, the basic guideline and also sector roadmap, we have been involved in the process of putting them together. So transition finance discussion is something that we're going to talk about. Therefore, I'm participating in this forum. Transition is the word to show the overall change up until 2050 of carbon neutrality. And we could think about this in two ways: until 2030 from now, and then from 2030 and onwards. From 2030 and onwards, we're working on various innovation like low-cost green hydrogen and carbon recycle. We expect these will be available after 2030. And then transition pathway up until 2050, there are various ones. There could be companies where they can directly reduce up until 2050. And in those cases, for those companies, maybe it doesn't make sense to divide between 2030, up until 2030 and beyond. But there are companies that will be able to achieve up until 2030 and the second phase after 2030. Therefore, it's important for those companies to distinguish between the first half and the second half. There are things that they can do in 2030, like energy sufficiency, energy conservation, and other steady measures. There are limited things that they can do, and therefore the greenhouse gas emission reduction will be moderate. But this is important in order to make sure they can come up with the more radical reduction afterwards and innovation. And then they will be able to make larger investment afterwards so that they can achieve the goals. So that's another way of achieving the goals. And the issue is how the first half will be seen from the investors, because it's not considered to be an ideal curve, and therefore some investors will think it's not good, they will divest. If that is the case, they actually dip the butt for innovation for the future, which we want to avoid. Therefore, the industry and the financial market has to really understand the importance of this first half, and I think this is going to be the important theme as we consider the transition finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And over to Ms. Karine Smith-Ihnaho now in, I'm not sure where you are, but in Europe. Over to you.
Thank you, Tova. And I'm actually in London, so it's morning here in London, but very nice to be part of these very interesting discussions. So let me start by saying that climate risk is financial risk. So the financial sector, and in particular large institutional investors like us, definitely have a role and an interest in an orderly climate transition. So I represent the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, often referred to as NBIM, and we are invested in more than 9,000 companies in more than 70 countries. So we hold on average 1.4% of all listed companies globally. And as you see from this overview here, this slide, Japan is our second largest market, so a very important market for us. We have around 8.2 trillion yen invested in Japan. And here you can also see our top 10 holdings in Japan. And let me say that we very much appreciate being a shareholder in the Japanese market. And I have very fond memories of many company meetings there. But as an owner of a small portion of the world's economy, we bear the same climate risk. And we cannot divest away from climate change. Divesting is to pass the problem to others. So I very much agree with the previous speaker that we need to tackle the problem at its core, and that is reduced emissions from the companies we invest in. And when we look at our portfolio, 15% of our portfolio is in companies that need to transition either in the way they operate or what they produce. And as a shareholder, we can influence these companies and we use these right actively. So as an example, last year we discussed climate change in almost 800 company meetings. So this represents around 1/3 of the fund's net asset value. But influencing companies starts with setting clear expectations. And we expect companies to adopt climate plans in line with the Paris Agreement. And this means net zero by 2050. And the climate transition is ultimately a board responsibility. And we will hold the board to account and increasingly vote against the boards that we do not think sufficiently manage climate risk. And in the end, if we see no changes, we may choose to divest. But our main efforts will be to invest and support the companies that will be a part of the new green economy. And let me end by saying we look forward to engaging with Japanese companies in this important work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karine. So we see a lot of key words, I think, coming up again and again. We're hearing a lot about collaboration. We're hearing a lot about transparency and partnerships and things as well. One key thing that has just come up, I think, is the issue of potentially divesting if an organization is not living up to what it says it was going to do, is not on track. Currently, the ESG ratings, if you're trying to evaluate a potential investment, are quite opaque. They're difficult to compare. We're hearing a lot of talk in the media of greenwashing coming up when it comes to sustainability ambitions. So as finance providers, when you're considering potential investments, how do you evaluate the integrity of an organization's ratings or efforts towards its net zero goals? So I'd like to start maybe with Kihara-san on that one. いいですか?
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. So this is a very difficult issue. So ESG convergence is one thing, and ultimately ISBB is the place where they will discuss to solve this issue. But as you said, I don't think the evaluation criteria is not really set. Therefore, we need to look at the reports from industries or companies and look at ESG ratings to really analyze the strategies for a company. That's all we can do at this point. And there may be no comparability and maybe not much comparability. And what's difficult is how to evaluate the transition strategy. What is the KPI we can use to measure them? And what kind of commitment can we bring out from them? There are a lot of things we need to think about. And whether we can avoid greenwashing, I think it lies in the process of doing this. Whether we can avoid greenwashing lies in our ability to really assess those companies as fund financiers.
Absolutely, yes, and really key points there. And I think something that came up in the first panel was the talk of credibility, and Kihara-san also touched on this as well. And very much relating to what you're saying, how do you evaluate a strategy? And the ISSB are working on creating aligned standards, but that's still a work in progress. So we've got to get started before that's already in motion. Not an easy task. So could I come back to Keidanren, you as well, on that question? How would you evaluate, or how are you evaluating the integrity of the investments you're considering?
Yeah, this is a hugely important issue, because if we want finance to flow to the greener companies, we really need good information on how the company is doing when it comes to transformation and their pathways towards net zero. And as we heard, it's now we don't really have a comparable standard yet. I mean, it's great what the ISSB is doing, but they're not finished yet. So we have for a long time urged company for better sustainability reporting that can be comparable across market and across sector. It is improving year by year, and we are assessing how companies are doing, and there's improvements, but there's still a long way to go, because you really need granular information if you are going to assess a company, really how they're doing in the transition. We also see, we see sector differences, we see geographical differences, and what we do see is that Asia is somewhat behind on a sort of overall level than Europe. So I would take this opportunity to urge Japanese companies to really think about their sustainability reporting. But having said that, I like what I see when it comes to improving of standards, and hopefully in the end, proper sustainability reporting in accordance to a global standard will become mandatory.
Yes, that would be a wonderful thing to see, and I'm sure very helpful from both sides of the perspective as well. So thank you, Keidanren. So moving back to Judson, you mentioned already at the beginning in your introduction the sort of ranking system you were using, and the fact that you'd looked at some companies and said perhaps they weren't doing enough and had moved away from working with them. But now could we look at what are some of the key instruments and frameworks that can be used to support transition and transition finance? What are those looking like now? And do you think those are going to look the same in, say, 5 to 10 years, or are they going to look quite different?
Yeah, this is a very active space of innovation at the moment. This is focused on how to actually frame and think about transition finance. So I think we saw a great example already earlier today in terms of the work that's gone on in Japan to really think this through, because at the end of the day, it does need to get sector specific. Within sector, you need to differentiate companies. It will differ by countries in terms of their pathways. So getting to that level of specificity is critically important. In terms of financial instruments, I think probably a lot of them exist. It's a question of how we use them. Certainly one of the good innovations the past few years has been the sustainability linked instruments, be they either loans or bonds. I think those provide an interesting ability to really tailor a specific KPI to a company to make it relevant for their corporate strategy. Because at the end of the day, when we think about transition, we think about transition of companies. That's the level at which we invest. That's the level at which we extend credit to. It's to companies. And so we want to understand their corporate strategy. And that's where the disclosure rules we heard about are quite helpful. The framing that the TCFD has always provided: governance, strategy, risk and opportunity, and then in the metrics and targets. We think that's a very useful framework for a company to articulate its approach. And then you can essentially, within that, pick out the specific KPIs that are relevant for that, construct a financing instrument that essentially allows a company to prove it is on a good transition path and essentially benefit from that financially. So I think in many ways here, we have a lot of the tools and instruments, the disclosure rules, trying to map out pathways, trying to come up with specific KPIs that are relevant for companies. It's just a matter of deepening all of this and putting that framing around it. That's where I think the transition finance discussion and the way that, say, Japan has presented it is quite critical to make sure that we really think about this as a journey. It's a transition. We don't go from carbon intense production to fully decarbonized overnight. We don't get 200% green overnight. This is a journey. And so we need to allow companies to articulate their plan for that journey, then provide them the financing along that journey, give them credit where possible for their success, and then ultimately work with as we talked a little bit about divestment, walking away, but that's not the preferred way. That can't be that has to be the exception much more than the rule. It's about working with and making companies successful on this transition.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for those points. And picking up on that, the fact that this transition is very different from industry to industry and also in different countries depending on their level of development. So I'd like to come back to Takegahara-san now. So countries within Asia are at very different stages on that transition journey, on the development journey. So how can we account for that in transition finance? How do you ensure as a finance provider that the money you're providing is going where it's really needed? It's going to be put to the best use.
That is a difficult issue. So the energy mix, or the industrial structure, or the location, there are lots of different preconditions, which means the transition strategy will differ. There's no mistake there. But the goal is the same, 2050 carbon neutral. That goal is already decided. And towards that goal, the pathway can be diverse, which means in Asia, Asia has its own unique pathways maybe. And earlier on, as was said, depending on the company, the pathway should be diverse. So the issue is, how can finance make the decisions? And what's important is, ICMA's handbook says it has to be scientifically based. So there are diverse pathways, and we need to have the scientific justification for making the decision. We need to have those diverse means of doing so. Right now, by industry, there are roadmaps made by METI, and that is the approach that Japan is taking. But targeting Asia, the finance, is it justifiable to discern that? We need to be able to evaluate. We need to have the scientific basis for making that evaluation. That's what we need.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. It's very easy to set ambitious targets, I think, that sound wonderful, but unless there is science behind it, it's very difficult to really see whether we're making progress and to evaluate it effectively. So thank you for that point. What is the role of industry and cross-sector collaboration in creating sustainable finance initiative in the near term? So we're seeing a very different picture, as Takegahara-san was talking about, in the maybe from now until 2030, what needs to happen then, but then also beyond that towards 2050. So what is the collaboration that you would like to see happening in the near term to really accelerate what needs to happen in transition finance? So Judson, I'll come to you first on that one.
Yeah, I think it's on multiple levels. It's government to industry, it's real economy to finance sector, it's within finance sector to agree the concepts. And ultimately, I think it's really about not getting lost in the details and really just moving things forward step by step. You know, as we just heard, you know, the end goal is clear, 2050. How we get there will differ. And I think the great thing in this whole journey that we're on is everyone has their role to play. Everyone can do something that plays to their strength. If they're in the finance sector and they're more a lender, that's where they focus. If they're a universal investor like Norges, they can have great power there. You know, the governments obviously have key roles to play to map out, you know, the pathways for their sectors, put in place, you know, the carrots and sticks for transitions to occur. And then the real economy companies obviously are really the key to all this, because they will be the ones who really achieve that productive transition that occurs. So I think collaboration in all ways, shapes, and forms is really what this is all about. But the great thing is everyone has their role to play, and that should play to their strengths. And at the end of the day, I think it's just making sure we don't do too much duplication and really, you know, simplify things where we can and focus on getting things moving as quick as we can.
Yes, absolutely agree. Karine, come to you with the same question there. What are the key collaborations for your industry, and how do you see those sort of being important in the near term, but also perhaps changing as we look further ahead to 2050?
Yeah, I very much agree with Judson that in the sense we all should play to our strengths and contribute where we can. I mean, this is the large problem of the world, and we all need to come together and collaborate. I think from the financial industry perspective, we have to look at then what can we do, and I think there's essentially sort of three things. One is to be a supporter and a driver for better regulation, you know, contribute to standard setting, good regulation that sort of lift the bar for all companies. The second is to really look at how we invest. What type of companies do we invest in? How can we best use our financial strength to support the transition? So that sort of goes to the portfolio. And the third thing is really to go at company level and see how can we best support and challenge the companies we have invested in. And I think here there's some great collaborative efforts going on in the financial sector. Judson mentioned Climate Action 100+. There are others. There are collaborative efforts around defining good pathways on a sector basis, science-based target setting, etc. So I think the more the financial industry can come together and work on the various companies in different sectors, the more power we will have. I mean, we are large, one of the largest investors in the world, but in the end, we only own 1.4% of every listed company. So if we can come together with other large investors, of course, we'll have much more power behind our challenge and support to the companies we're invested in.
Yes, thank you for that. So it's interesting to hear that you're talking about support, but also challenging as well. So really pushing things forward, encouraging companies that if they want the investment, they really need to prove they're making progress and to demonstrate that clearly. Thank you. So again, with an eye on the time, very conscious of that, I'd like to ask each of the panelists maybe for a few final comments on this. We heard in the first panel from the recipients' perspective what they're looking for investment, what their challenges are. As finance providers, when you are looking to the recipients, what would you like to see them doing? What would you like to ask of them moving forward? So Takegahara-san, I'll come to you first for that.
Depending on the company, the strategy will differ. So that company and the transition that is thinking of, and the innovation and its connectedness to innovation. So the strategy, following the timeline, we want them to show us. And we, as much as possible, through financial monitoring or using the power of finance, we want to support them. That's our role. So transition it's a very difficult to grasp, ambiguous kind of strategy. And both sides need to try to properly find the pathway together. I think that's important.
Absolutely, and I think that's where the work that we were hearing about earlier that Japan is doing on creating the roadmaps for particularly the hard-to-abate industries and then measuring that against the company's own strategy is very, very helpful, right? You can see if those things are aligned as a provider of finance. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so come to Judson as well, same question. What would you like to ask of the recipients of investment?
Yeah, it is very much about that strategy. And I think the one thing we in the finance sector cannot necessarily be is too dictative or too demanding necessarily. It's about working with our clients and recognizing the challenges they have. You can't necessarily get too far ahead of your clients, or if you do, you're going to be a little bit on your own. And so this, I think from our perspective, it really is about supporting and working with and understanding the clients' strategies and their needs, and then trying to support them through that. And I think as was well said, it is people a bit grappling through the dark at times, trying to figure out what is the transition path for their sector, for their company, and that will not necessarily be a straight, linear, smooth transition. It will come in lumps at times, and so recognizing that complexity is very, very important for us.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And finally, Keidanren, what are your thoughts on this?
I think our ask, in a way it's difficult but very clear, is that every companies need a climate plan that takes them to net zero in 2050. They also need to have short and medium term targets. And I agree, the journey there can be very different depending on where you are today, which sector you're in. But in the end, in order to be relevant in net zero in 2050, you as a company need to go there. And in the end, that's the responsibility of the board. So we will ask each board to have a good think about how are they going to get there and be transparent on their targets, on their pathway, and report against it.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So just to wrap up, I think what we've heard here from the different industry perspectives that we've heard of, some of them extremely challenging to transition, is that collaboration and partnerships are going to be absolutely key for this. We're going to need standardization. We're moving towards that already. We're seeing Japan doing some great work on that, but also within industries as well, and within the finance industry, looking at clarity on how we evaluate the validity, the credibility of potential investments. So collaboration, dialogue is going to be key. We had a very short time to discuss this topic today. It's a huge topic, and I hope everybody here and online will take the opportunity to speak to each other, ask each other what your organizations are doing, speak to the embassies. I think collaboration between countries, learning between countries and companies is also going to be absolutely essential here. So thank you very much to all the panelists for today, and to the embassies and the Keidanren for hosting us. And I'd like to hand back now to Lina, Ambassador from Norway, for final comments.
Dear dear speakers and panelists and dear guests. I think we could have gone on for hours, actually. This is such an interesting topic, and we just barely touched on some vital aspects. But on behalf of the organizers, the Swiss Embassy, the Norwegian Embassy, and our partners in Keidanren, allow me to thank you for your cooperation and your participation here today. As many of you have emphasized, the world economy will need to undergo a far-reaching transformation over the next decades. Large industrial players, such as those participating here today, Equinor, JFE Steel, and Syngenta, are at the very center of this transformation. So it's so heartening to hear that you are taking this transition so seriously and working on the financing of reaching the climate goals in your respective businesses. At the same time as these sweeping changes are happening in businesses and industries across our countries, we see that this requires substantial investments. Great transition requires transition financing, and it is therefore very encouraging to see that large financial actors such as the Development Bank of Japan, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and Swiss UBS are approaching the issue of transition finance so diligently. You are very conscious of the critical role you play today and in our transition going forward. We have also heard that governments play a vital role in this picture. We had the pleasure of having Deputy Director General Kihara-san of METI explaining to us how the Japanese government is approaching the issue of transition finance. And we know that an economy such as the Japanese economy, with world-leading companies in many sectors that have been considered hard to abate, this is a very serious issue at hand. The work METI has done so far is impressive, and we look forward to following the continuation. Thank you so much, Kihara-san, for your contribution. The other day, chatting with one of the Norwegian companies present here today, DNV, I actually realized that we have many companies in our business community working on this issue, as the market for transition finance is steadily growing. And this demonstrates the importance of the topic we have been discussing here today. So I thank all of you for joining us. Now, on behalf of the organizers, to our speakers and panelists, to our audience joining us online, and of course to our audience here physically present today in Tokyo, I would like to thank you for the time you've taken out of your busy schedule to spend with us here today. And to those of you in person here, I would like to invite you to join us at the back of the room for a glass of delicious Swiss wine. So thank you very much for your attention here today. Thank you.